Hello and welcome to BIOS Builders. Today, we're absolutely thrilled to welcome Keith Gottesdiener, President and CEO of Prime Medicine, to the show. Keith, thank you once again for joining us.
It's absolutely my pleasure to be here. It's a story I love to tell. So let's dig into it.
Let's dive right in, like you're saying. Before we get started, though, Keith, would you mind sharing a brief personal introduction with us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I've been in the drug development business for a very, very long period of time. I'm an MD by training, spent 10 or 15 years doing basic research at Columbia and at Harvard, and retired from Columbia as an associate professor. Spent 16 years at Merck running whole air parts of early development and late development, brought a whole number of drugs across the finish line. So had a chance to see the process from very early, when things are laboratory based, all the way through to approval and commercialization. In 2011, I had the chance to join Rhythm Pharmaceuticals as CEO, as the third or fourth employee. And Rhythm, where I spent 9 years as CEO, managed to bring a very important drug forward for rare genetic obesity for 3 indications. And as that company really transitioned to become a commercial company, I felt it really was the right time for me to go and get involved with something really new where I could start a company again and really do something really exciting from the science point of view. And Prime was perfect. They hired me in just as the pandemic hit. I was the second or third employee there, and it's a great technology, everything that I really hoped it would have been.
And that's the perfect introduction. Before we dive deeper, can you just provide a brief intro to Prime for us?
Sure. I'm sure we're going to be talking a little bit about Prime and Prime Editing, which is really what the company was really built around. So I'll wait till we get to that to go into many details about the science. But Prime was spun up as a company in the summer of 2020. Yeah, 2020. And as I mentioned, I was the third employee there. It was really based on an incredible paper by David Liu and Andrew Anzalone that got published in Nature at the end of 2019. And we'll talk about that paper as well. Just to talk about the company, though, for a second beforehand, it's a Cambridge-based company. We started with a small number of employees in the middle of the pandemic. We're now about 240 people, mostly in Cambridge, 4 to 5 locations there as well. We've recruited a great team of people, a great leadership team overall. We've raised well in excess of $500 million to really support things. And as I think you probably know, last October, we did a really successful IPO in a really, really tough market. So we're really pretty happy with where things are going. Now, of course, the primary goal of the company isn't logistic, building, and it isn't fundraising. The real purpose of the company, of course, is to really bring really some of the special things that Prime Editing can do to patients. So we're really focused on the therapeutics that we can really bring in places where we can work that we think no one else can work.
That's a phenomenal introduction. And to dive deeper, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Drew, to talk a little bit more about Prime's origin story. Keith, thank you again so much for joining us and sharing more about yourself and about the company.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. Keith, it's wonderful to have a conversation with you. Just dive into Prime here. And look, taking it back to the origin story, I would just love to start. You were an early employee after that amazing paper in 2019. The Prime basis, just we're talking about with Prime Editing, the genesis really seeking just to dramatically increase the impact of gene editing for a broad range of therapeutic applications. It's been amazing to see the growth of Prime and what you all have done in the past few years. But just taking a step back here before we dive in, could you just tell us more about the genesis of Prime? What was the spark that started it all?
Well, there's no question this paper by Andrew Anzalone and David Liu really was the spark. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what made that paper so special. And it really was very special in many ways. But let me start by just saying Andrew Anzalone and David Liu are an incredible pair. Andrew Anzalone is the really special, almost maybe the right word to use is brilliant postdoc who really conceived of the idea of Prime Editing, brought it to David's laboratory. The two of them really developed it together during the course of leading up to the paper. And the paper I had read before I left Rhythm, I read Nature and Science and Cell pretty regularly as a sort of an ex-research science. And I remember reading it back in December of 2019 saying, wow, this is really incredible. I don't understand all the nuances of gene editing at that point, but this looks like an amazing step forward. As I started to really think about going to Prime and I looked more carefully at that paper, in some ways it became just even more amazing what they had accomplished. What David and Andrew had done, I'm not sure if this was conscious or unconscious. I've never asked them. I like it better to think that this was all the way they were thinking about things. They literally sat down and they said, if you look at previous ways we can engineer the genome, gene therapy, CRISPR-Cas9 approaches and all their variants, base editing, what is it we're missing? What can't we do that we would really want if we were going to make gene editing a major therapeutic modality? And literally, they appear to have made a list and literally checked off each of the boxes. Well, we'd like to do this. Check. Let me show that in the paper. And we'd like to do this. Check. We can actually do that in that paper. And they literally work through each, shall we call it, missing element in the gene editing story up to that point, and show that prime editing really addressed it. That's what really is amazing. Now, of course, that's wonderful from the company's point of view, but even more importantly is it helped to really settle for me, and I think for many potential investors and people who are coming, we don't have to hypothesize about whether this is really a step forward. You can literally look at the data and the experience. Now, we have great fortune to keep very close, interactions with David Liu and Andrea Anzalone. David, of course, is head of our SAB and, very important to the company. And he's continued to push great improvements in prime editing into the company. But probably even more important in some ways, Andrew Anzalone really wanted to see his conception move towards therapeutics. And he joined the company as head of our innovation group. And he's just been so helpful, really, to help us to move prime editing forward.
I really love that introduction. And it's amazing to see how David and Andrew were able to sit down and put that into the seminal work. Especially, it just says something very keen about IP in regards to trust in early investors and just support there. Thank you again for sharing that, Keith. I just want to take it back to that moment real quick. I'm really glad you discussed kind of the current problems within gene editing. Before we really chat about Prime's approach, maybe if we could just dive into that list a little bit more beyond the paper, just from your own perspective, Keith, could you discuss some of the current issues, the current problems in the gene editing space right now?
Sure. And I'm not 100% sure I would call them problems in some ways, as much as many of the current approaches are going to do great things for patients, but companies who are working in those approaches have to find the places where that technology seems to be best applied. In other words, where are places where that technology can do those things for patients? And of course, we're seeing that with some of the things that CRISPR companies are doing. Beam is a base editing company, even the gene therapy companies are doing. But when you sit down and you think about it, there are so many places where those technologies really just can't reach. And and as a result of that, that just means there are huge unmet needs for patients that can't be addressed by those technologies. Despite all we see about all the companies who are working in gene editing or other kinds of approaches similar to that, you got to remember there's 7,000 or more is the estimate for rare genetic diseases, let alone other gene editing areas where one could work. And so when you add up all the pipeline things, I don't know what the number is, but it's in the tens or maybe in the hundreds. And the nice thing about prime editing is it can really address a great majority of those other places as well. So what are some of the things? Well, first of all, prime editing, as far as we believe, is the only technique that can actually correct genes. So most of the other techniques, and of course, I don't want to downplay base editing can do that to a limited degree, but most of the other techniques are more at disabling genes that have toxic effects or potentially trying to replace genes in a way that really leaves them under not so controllable elements overall. Okay. So when we think about this, I think there are four areas that there are problems where we think Prime is solving. So the first one is versatility. Okay. We can correct any kind of single base pair mismatch that occurs. If there are 4 letters in the DNA alphabet, there are 12 ways they can mismatch. We can correct all of them. Base editing, for example, corrects only 4 of those 12, and CRISPR and other approaches can't even correct any of them under most circumstances. We can do small insertions and deletions to correct mutations, because there are mutations where there are pieces missing or pieces that need to be added back to correct a gene as well. We can work in hotspots. So prime editing can actually edit 100, 200. Looks like we're going to be able to get to 300 or 400 base pairs at a time. And as you guys probably know, and many of your listeners know, genes have certain areas that are critical to the gene where if a mutation occurs there, it's very impactful on that particular gene, causing a disease. And there's probably other areas where a mutation matters much less. Those hotspots are areas that matter. We can literally lay down a new template there across that whole region. So it doesn't matter if you have a mutation number 1 and Chris has a mutation number 2, everybody gets a completely pristine new copy. So we can, with one work of prime editing, we can take care of all kinds of mutations. More recently, we've learned that we can loop out very large pieces of DNA. So kilobases or more in size. We've seen that in some of our work that we do with repeat expansion diseases or triplet repeat diseases like Huntington's disease, where we literally can go in as if we had a surgical scalpel, cut out just the pathological repeats and put the DNA back together. Now, that isn't exactly how it happens, of course. We don't go in with the scalpel, but the whole idea is that we can gene edit these things. And when we're done, to all intents and purposes, it appears as if it's a genetic cure. We've turned someone's bad DNA into what would be normal DNA as well. But in the most recent past, using a new technology we call PASSIGE, which is an acronym for a very long name, we can now put in multi-kilobase pieces of DNA into the genome. And the thing about that is, because people can put DNA into the genome today, lentivirus does that as a delivery method, but you really have no control about where it goes in. So the thing about this is we can put it in a specific programmable location. We can put it into the endogenous, the normal locus. And so it's under the control of all the regulatory sequences that one would expect would normally turn that on or off. And when I illustrate that to investors, I say to them things like, well, if you had the chance to have a gene therapy and you were now on your way home from the hospital and you got into a car accident and you started bleeding, would you be happier if your hemoglobin gene was under the normal control, which recognizes that you're bleeding and it's time to turn up that gene? Or would you feel better that it's in some situation where some really smart scientist or postdoc guessed what the control mechanism should be and really built it into some other kind of vector? I know what my answer would be. Now, that's a very simplistic example, and I don't want people to take me literally when I talk about that, but that endogenous control is important as well. Second thing has to do with precision. So like base editing, prime editing doesn't cause what are called double-strand breaks in the DNA, which is an emergency. Breaking your chromosome into 2 pieces, cells really hate that. They treat it as an emergency and they do anything they can to fix it. When they're done, that spot is very ugly. But of course, that's why CRISPR technology in its most basic sense is so great at really inactivating genes, because it basically fills them in a very random way. Prime editing doesn't cause double-stranded breaks, and it's a multi-stage process. So at each stage, there's an edit check on, are you in the right place? Are you making the right edit? And so we seem to have, and there's still more work for us to do, but we seem to have incredibly low off-target activity. In fact, in our first program that's moving towards the clinic, we see no off-target activity to date. Now, that could easily change tomorrow, but it just gives you some idea of how minimal that is. And frankly, in the long run, we think that safety of gene editing is going to be important. We're going to need to look patients in the eye and doctors in the eye and say, we're going to go in, we're going to fix that edit, and we're not going to muck around elsewhere in your genome. We're going to tell you what we're going to do, and we're going to get out, and you don't have to worry about anything else as well. Just two more quick points. Those were the long ones. I do tend to give long answers to short questions. But the third one is it's a very efficient process. People worry, and we've heard a lot of comments from people that prime editing is very low efficiency. And in practice, in the scientific literature, you could get that impression. Scientists don't have to optimize to make a therapeutic. But a lot of the know-how and the improvements in prime editing of what have gotten things from editing efficiencies of 20 or 30%. Now we're doing 70, 80, 90. As a matter of fact, our lead compound that we hope is moving towards an IND, last experiment we did, we had 92% editing efficiency overall. And finally, there's tremendous breadth. You've gotten that impression. When we look at lists of pathogenic mutations, we can do 90% or more of the known pathogenic mutations. And that's an old estimate, is before some of the new capabilities came in. We know that we can correct them overall. So in the process of telling you what prime can do, I'm also, by the same token, telling you what most other approaches cannot do.
For certain. I think it also alluded to what the state of the current industry is. And I'm excited to dive in deeper further on with you, Keith, about just the future of the industry, future of the space, because as we're seeing these 7,000 disease sites, new necessities just for orphan drugs, new areas, certainly the space itself is just ever more present and emerging. But the versatility that Prime offers certainly is inspiring. It's great to hear from your perspective. Just diving in, Keith, here, just to continue on, I think I would really just love to take a step back as a seasoned executive, as a two-time CEO, someone who spent a long time, to dive in and just chat a bit more through Prime Solution. We again recently had a conversation with David Liu discussing much of the academic spin outside of base editing, prime editing, a lot of the fundamentals there. And I think some of the questions I would love to ask more is yourself at the helm as a CEO, some ideas, some questions around the broader thematic approach of a gene editing company seeking to commercialize their work out of academia, because I think this space is a huge emerging space. It's burgeoning since you all have just, exploded since early 2019, forming the company in 2020. And just keeping it concise here to have a continuation. I mean, your platform, as you mentioned, is currently progressing a diversified portfolio of 18 programs, really initially focused on genetic diseases, right? Andrew jumping in on the therapeutic pipeline. But as a seasoned biotech executive, I just want to take a moment just to speak about the commercialization of Prime. Could you tell us more about the unique challenges just broadly facing gene editing companies just face commercializing novel technology just from academia to approval? Would love to get your thoughts as someone just on the ground floor there.
Yeah, so anytime a new technology comes along, I think there are a bunch of questions that are very generic. And then, of course, there's always very specific questions to a technology. I do think one of the things when you have a really powerful new technology is really figuring out how to understand it best and where it could work overall. And if there's time, we can talk about our pipeline and how we strategically pick the indications to really explore where prime editing can work, what are the places or the most efficient ways to use it, kinds of mutations it could do best, the kinds of delivery systems it might work with. We've done a tremendous amount of work on that, and it's really come out in our pipeline. But if you speak about the industry in general, I think what you want to think about is there's a couple of things that are different when you're academic, and as you start to move things towards approval and getting them to patients. So first of all, the scale of the work changes, right? You're no longer working in a test tube to do the work that you're doing. You're trying to figure out how does it work at a scale that matters. And while to many folks, it seems as if, okay, going from one test tube to a flask, from a flask to a big shaker flask, from a big shaker flask to a bioreactor, how hard could that be? In practice, the world is littered with technologies that can make those transitions and scale. So there's a tremendous amount of work that you can do to do that. A lot of that is elbow grease and grit just going forward. And we've been very lucky so far to have a really special head of our technology, the manufacturing and development side of those kinds of things, who has really led us through. Her name is Ann Lee, and she's registered more drugs than I have. It's a little annoying to actually acknowledge that, but she's just been able to lead us through that. Second thing is, whatever you need to do has to be robust. In other words, you need to be able to not just scale it up, but you need to be able to do it over and over and over again. And from a regulatory point of view, you really need to be able to show that every time you decide to try something, or you're going to prepare something, or you're going to treat people, they're getting the same thing as they would have gotten under other circumstances. Third is the quality of that. You can do a scientific experiment with a semi-pure reagent or chemical or contact or piece of genetic machinery that you need to do. You need to be able to not only deliver high quality things, but you need to be able to prove that they're high quality things, which is an enormous amount of time and energy on assays and other kinds of things. Fourth, you need processes that are going to help people understand each time you do things, you don't want to reinvent the wheel, because you can do something bespoke the first time you do things. But what you really should be doing is paying attention of, is this the way I'm going to want to do it 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Or am I just doing it the fastest, shortest way that I can do it today? And so good companies are always thinking about, is this process one that's not just going to scale, not just be robust, not just demonstrate quality, but it's one we're going to want to live with a long period of time. And then last but not least, as a company, particularly a public company, you have to execute. Okay. When push comes to shove, if you're a postdoc and you want to take an extra year or two to work on a project, assuming you can get a little bit of funding, no one really cares. Okay. But if you're a company and you suddenly go out to investors and say, hey, we took a little long term and it's going to take 2 years longer, that's exactly the kind of thing that really can destroy a company that has nothing to do with the technology. So I think there are many such things you need to do. Now, in some ways, I think Prime has approached that challenge in a couple of ways. One is we work very hard to build a great organization. And while everything is never perfect in any organization, I think we've been much more successful than we had any right to be. I don't think we're the only Cambridge company for which that's true. There's an incredible set of talent in Cambridge, but we've been very lucky to put that together. Second thing is, if you're going to go through those 5 steps that I mentioned, you have to know what the beginning, the middle, and the end look like. So companies do better, and this is certainly true of Prime, if people have been around the process a couple of times. If you've never registered a drug and you don't know what the end game looks like, it's really hard to start out, not really know where to aim your company. So much better if you develop a whole number of drugs, like Ian and I, for example, just as examples have done. And then the third thing is you have to create a culture in some ways where people are willing to learn and make mistakes, try different kinds of things, be flexible, but always look forward. Because there's no question there's going to be speed bumps in the road as you start to scale these companies up. But you have to build a way of dealing with those things, a flexibility of mind that is really important. And I joke with my folks that we're in a bucking bronco, like a rodeo driver and rider. We're holding on. Every day we're learning new things. We need to keep some strategic idea of where we're going, that we're not changing every day. But on the other hand, we have to be ready to look at what we're learning and apply it. And the good news for Prime has been almost everything we've learned is something that's positive, not always, but mostly. But it does make for a different kind of mindset as well. And then last but not least, and this is true, I think, for most biotechs I know about, you got to remember why you're doing this. In the end, it's not a science experiment. It's not it's not just a project. There are people out there who need this kind of stuff. And so you always have to keep in mind that we're doing it for that reason. And, when we're done, we we really need to make sure that we're delivering to those folks.
Certainly. And just as a continuation of scale, even just this past June, Prime recently entered yet another research collaboration partnership with Semio Therapeutics to develop prime-edited shield cell immunotherapy pairs, mostly in your all's focus for acute myeloid leukemia. And I think I just wanted to take a moment to discuss partnerships and scale, Keith. Could you maybe just discuss this opportunity of this partnership broadly, some of the other folks that you're interested in partnering with in the future as well?
Sure. So first of all, I don't think you described it the way we look at it from Prime. So if I were sitting in Semeo's shoes, and there's a perfect, everything you said is perfect from their shoes. Yeah. I want them to use Prime editing to help with the shielding approach. And the idea behind it, just very briefly, is very clear. If you want to put in new stem cells in particular in people, hematopoietic stem cells, that form all the blood lineages, you have to create space in the bone marrow for those cells to go in after you've edited them or you've manipulated them in some way. And today, the way we do it is pretty brutal. We basically give people chemotherapy, there's profound immunosuppression, and then the new cells go in, and there's a long period of time that people are at risk and things can actually happen. So the original idea of using some of these approaches was a gentler form of chemotherapy by really just targeting those stem cells. And then the companies who really conceived of shielding, there are a number of them, but Semio has been at the forefront to, realize that you could potentially edit cells in a way that prevented them or shielded them from this new approach for chemotherapy, a much milder form, essentially, not really even chemotherapy, but new immunosuppression approaches, so that the new cells you're putting in were not affected by that, but only the old cells were. It's a wonderful idea. Semio came to us to talk about exactly that, doing this in acute myelogenous leukemia and myelodysplastic syndromes, MDS. And really what they had discovered was a change in these cells, or one of the proteins in these cells, could prevent or shield those cells from their chemotherapy equivalent, which was really to use an antibody. And in the process of doing that, they realized that prime editing was the only technique today that can actually make the shielding effect. So they came to us and said, we'd like to use that. What they didn't realize was prime editing can be done in a multiplex manner. You can make many edits at the same time. So what we did is we worked with them to sort of change the scope of the deal. You guys go off and do what you want in AML and MDS. We'll help you. On the other hand, what they've given to us is the chance to multiplex. We can make the therapeutic edit that we want to make to stem cells, as well as the shielding element. So in the end, what it's going to mean is for all of our hematopoietic, bone marrow related programs, if this continues to work, we'll be able to use the shielding without really any intense chemotherapy, again, if everything works out, and do the therapeutic edits. And they were kind enough to give us really the ability to do essentially all rare genetic diseases with their approach overall. So from our point of view, it's a way to make much more gentle approaches and to really open up places where people are not willing to get today's type of bone marrow in order to have a curative procedure. If we make this a lot simpler and easier for people, whole new diseases may open up that people would be willing to undergo this. Now, you also asked me about future collaborations. Can't say much about that as a public company, as you can imagine. We have a lot of business development activity going on, from people who might want to partner things in our pipeline today to people who have come to us with, we have a problem that's not in your pipeline, but prime editing can solve it. Could we work on it? That's kind of where Semio started in a certain way, not exactly, but close, as well as partnering with other technologies. And that's where Semio ended, places where two technologies are complement to each other. So I think you'll see more about that. Probably the area where we're most interested in thinking about that is we've just done some really remarkable gene editing in the CAR T space, okay? And probably Prime isn't that interested in working in cancer because we don't have that expertise. So we're dealing with a lot of interest from companies that might want to use that technology in cancer. We're actually interested in using that technology more in autoimmune, okay, or immunological diseases, which may be a new area where our pipeline goes forward. But it's a great place for us to have a fruitful collaboration with someone, and it's something we're exploring quite avidly.
As we're thinking about some of Prime's history, Prime Medicine has been on a meteoric rise to success since its founding in late 2019, and you're joining Keith. And as you think about what you've done, commercializing this novel tool for genetic engineering, raising about $500 million to date, as you mentioned, and going public in the October of this past year, we'd love to ask, as you look back, and you've touched on some of this already, maybe what have been some of the greatest challenges that you've faced at Prime thus far? Has it been the company building angle? Has it been the macro markets? Has it been solving the delivery challenge? We'd just love to hear your thoughts.
Well, there's no question the delivery challenge is always on our mind for me and for just about every company these days. I'm actually quite optimistic about that because when I joined Prime, finding delivery companies was a lot harder, and now there are just a number of them around. One of the analysts had a delivery day, and I probably don't have the number right, but I think there were 30 delivery companies that presented at that day. And, that to me, that's pretty exciting. Plus, I get to see a lot of confidential information from companies we're talking to, and both Prime inside of us as well as with others, where I'm just seeing tremendous advances. Are we solved that yet? Absolutely not. But we're really in a different spot than we were even 3 or 4 years ago. There's no question the IPO is a challenge. I won't say much about that. I may save a word or two about that for a later question. I think the two biggest ones that I would say that are really challenges for us is building the organization, getting good people in, attracting them, keeping them excited about the work, helping them to really feel the mission that we're doing, and wanting them to decide this is the place where they want to work. Considering Cambridge is filled with opportunities, there's no question that is by far the thing that I should and often am spending most of my time on. I think the second thing is a problem that's a little more unique to Prime. If you can work anywhere, and of course that's an exaggeration, but just take it as a directional statement. If you can work anywhere, setting a strategic decision for that company, particularly in the setting of you're learning new things about the technology day by day. So how do you get that? We're heading in this direction, but we're being buffeted by new data, new opportunities, new ideas, new ways to do prime editing with new capabilities is by far the most challenging thing the company faces. Okay. And literally every day, and this is almost true, someone comes up with a great new way to use prime editing or a new disease, and trying to incorporate all the new possibilities without losing that continuity, it takes a tremendous amount of our time overall. It's fun, it's exciting, but it is really hard.
I can only imagine. And even as you're going through that, it must also actually tie in a little bit to our next question, which is we've asked about some of the challenges, and we'd love to ask in turn about some of, in your opinion, the greatest accomplishments or milestones. And I'm betting achieving some of that perspective and connection, bringing others to Prime in the right ways, has hopefully been one of those as well.
It has. So I won't say more about that, but obviously it's certainly on that list of what I think are accomplishments. We just have great people. There are a lot of great people around, but I'm just happy we're getting our share of them, and we've been very lucky at those folks. I think there's a couple of things. One is these 3 years have been the building out of prime editing. Okay. First of all, we were able to show that the original prime editing was as impactful as we thought, with very, very high efficiency, very high degrees of precision and lack of off-target activity, that we could work in just so many different types of edits under so many circumstances. That was a major step forward. I spent my first year waiting for the other shoe to drop. That almost always happens with a new technology. I'm not going to suggest that we didn't have any challenges with that along the way, but literally one by one, we've knocked off just about all the technical issues to the point where we can say anything that's left is engineering. That's hard work to do, but it just means we can actually see the end game and the steps that come there. Second of all, that goes along with that, as I mentioned, it's literally going to be 4 years from the day the company was founded and we took things out of David Liu's laboratory till we have an IND. That's just a sign of really impressive execution. Again, it's the people that made that happen, not me, but it's just something I'm very, very proud of. It's important to get this to patients, getting it done as quickly as possible without cutting corners, and we are not cutting corners, is really important. And then last but not least, if I could just throw it in, getting an IPO done in October of 2022, I'm going to be proud of that my whole life. It literally took extraordinary amounts of time and energy and talking to investors. And it wasn't just getting it done, but getting a really successful IPO done is something I'm going to treasure, that achievement for the rest of my life.
Oh, it's an incredible milestone for the company and for patients. And they were lucky to have you at the helm, Keith.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I would say it the other way. I'm very lucky that the people who helped to make that happen, really were the kind of people who could help me to move it forward. Believe me, I'm not taking responsibility for it, but I am taking pride in it.
Too humble for sure, Keith. And it's amazing to see the work you've had and just the speed at how much Prime has grown has just been truly inspiring and phenomenal and just amazing towards the future of patient impact. And I want to pivot our discussion to think a little more forward here. It's been absolutely amazing discussing the approach Prime has had to date, some of the successes, some of the challenges here. Just to take a moment, step back, looking forward here. From your own perspective, Keith, what's coming next for Prime?
So when I think about the answer to that question, I'm going to really focus on sort of the therapeutic side of things, as opposed to company building and other kinds of things as well. So I think over the next, let's call it 5 years, okay, I think the important thing that's going to happen is program after program is going to move into the clinic. We haven't given much detail on the timeline. What we said is we expect to submit an IND in 2024. We hope to have 1 to 2 in 2025 and more to follow. So if you go out 5 years from now to 28, I hope we'll have a good number of programs in the clinic. And certainly by that point, probably much sooner, I hope we're going to be able to show that Prime Editing works in human beings. And just as important, that it potentially delivers something that looks like a genetic cure. It's way too early to call it a genetic cure. And I think it's important to realize that we're not at all sure we can fix things that have already happened. But what we hope we can do is by doing these genetic corrections, what we can do is we can stop a disease in its track and, right there. And every doctor knows that if you stop a disease in its tracks, very often the body can repair some of the damage that's occurred up to that point, which is why sometimes doctors say people are going in the right direction, just stop. Let's let the healing occur, okay, as opposed to interfering. And this is a place where we'd stop the pathophysiology, the disease-causing element, and we can give the body at least the opportunity to get better. I also think that we're going to need great partnerships to get to that point with other folks outside of Prime. And I'm looking forward to the point that I think that'll be an important element of things as well. So, what it really comes to is we need to get into the clinic. We need to show Prime Editing works, and it really has to deliver on the promise. And we really can't do it.
Certainly, Keith. I mean, just thinking about patient impact and continuing looking into the future as a whole, with the adoption of Prime's platform, the future INDs that are upcoming in the next few years, really just the scale up of the broader precision medicine space will hopefully see the cost barriers and access to new tools such as Prime Editing just rapidly become industry standard across the board. And I think looking towards the future here, Keith, as a seasoned executive, someone that has been at the helm and has done some amazing work leading Prime, from your own perspective, when do you see these tipping points happening as far as industry standard and just wide market adoption in regards to gene editing and technologies like Prime editing?
So there's two sides of that. One part is when are these technologies, are people going to realize that these are often the approach to diseases that people should take? And the other part of it is when are we going to be able to make it practically something that every doctor can reach, hypothetically into their bag and give to patients? I think the first one is going to happen relatively rapidly, 5, 7, 10 years by 2030. I think there'll be many examples of where gene editing approaches are doing really important things for patients. Personally speaking, a little self-centered in a sense, or prime-centered, I think we're going to be a linchpin of a lot of that data because of all the capabilities we have and because we have that precision, that lack of off-target editing. But I think that part is going to happen within years. It's the question of when does it get to the point where people consider it completely standard. So you could take a pill, you could get an antibody, you could get gene edited. These are your choices. That's going to take a little bit longer. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is it is a new technique and we are changing people's genomes. We do need long-term data to be sure that there aren't unanticipated effects that occur. That's where I think the idea that prime editing, for example, may have very limited, or in some cases, no real risk of off-target activity. Again, we haven't proven that, but that's a hope. It's going to be very important because if that's true, the long-term data and the story we can tell patients and doctors is we're literally going to fix your disease. It's done. You are cured. And if we can actually get to the point where that happens, I think we'll be in great shape. I would point out we're far from that with the current approaches. There are still concerns with gene therapy. There are concerns with CRISPR-based technologies. There are concerns with base editing. And frankly, for many years, there should be concerns, no matter what I believe our data preliminarily shows, with prime editing as well. This is an area where the whole field has to convince people that in the end, if you undergo this procedure, you're not going to come out with unanticipated problems. And by the way, it's one of the reasons why Prime has started with very high unmet medical need situations and frankly, in smaller indications. We want our first data to come from places where everybody agrees that these patients needed a gene edit because they really had nothing else available to them. So as we learn, if God forbid, someday it turns out that there is something that isn't right, both we and they are going to feel like getting this gene editing is right. But I have a lot of faith. I'm going to feel better with data, but I have a lot of faith that as we follow many of these techniques along, we're going to be able to look people into the eye in the 2030s and say, this is a time when you really should get this. It is the standard of care.
Really inspiring to see it from your perspective, Keith. And I appreciate you diving into the prime-centric approach as far as the broader facing industry side, along with the initial enabling technologies that we could see to the future that you'd be excited to partner with or collaborate with to carry this out into market and make it industry standard. I want to quickly pass it over to my colleague, Chris, just to close out the episode and wrap up a few more forward-facing questions. But thank you again, Keith, for a wonderful conversation.
My pleasure.
And thank you, Drew. Thank you, Keith. As mentioned, before we come to a close, maybe a few rapid-fire questions just to cap things off. Sure. So, Keith, you're projecting out to 2030. But now imagine it's 2050. What are your thoughts? Where is Prime? Where is the gene medicine space at this point?
So again, these are predictions, and I'm not sure. I think anybody's ability to predict what's happening in the space who believes that any of these predictions has any real chance of happening should really rethink things. But a couple of thoughts. I do think gene editing is likely to become a major therapeutic focus as time goes on. It's been a long time getting there. And I would personally believe that that's going to be an approach that people are going to be embracing to really solve the problem. these diseases. And hopefully, if the safety comes through, solving them at an early point in life, so these diseases don't progress and even become manifest. I personally believe that most people in 2050 are going to know the genetic code, and doctors will be thinking prophylactically about what we should be doing as opposed to reacting to the response for things as well. I don't see some of the gene therapy approaches as being things that are still going to be very active in 2050. That could be wrong, but I do think those are places where if you can actually correct in situ at the actual genomic locus, you're going to have tremendous advantages, especially if you can target them to a specific spot overall. And I think what I'm going to be expecting is these will be genetic cures. Someone may be diagnosed, and if they were diagnosed, a baby, for example, or a young child, then what will happen is there'll be a whole panoply of approaches. Matter of fact, I think someday, because many of these approaches are very modular, only a small part changes from disease to disease, but much of the machinery is used over and over and over again. Kind of hoping that we'll get to the point where we actually can do this for N=1 type people. So even the rarest diseases, it'll make sense for someone to use a gene editing approach. Now, again, this is a place very self-serving, but I certainly expect that prime editing is going to be right smack in the middle of it and to be a key player of it as well.
I love that prediction and very much hoping for the same. And as we think now about your success with Prime, it really could be said that you've sort of blitz scaled a company and in such a way that is truly successful. As you're pointing out, you're going to IND within 4 years. So I guess I would be curious to hear, were there any really strong learnings that you took away from that process? Or anything that you might, looking back, have improved upon, out of curiosity?
So my answers are going to sound a little trite. Okay, it all comes down to the people who are working with you, and in the end, I would say over and over again, building a great company is the way you get things done well and fast and robustly. It all comes down to people doing their parts as well. And companies that can't or won't spend the time on that, and I think most companies do, but some do it better than others, really missing the opportunity to really do something really special overall. So I think that part is very important. I don't think there's much else that I would say. I think in a jocular sort of funny way, going to become a public company in this environment has not been the best last 6 months of my life overall, because we're in an investor milieu where people are asking you when's your clinical data every minute. So maybe in the end, I would have probably thought a little bit more about maybe going public in 24 instead of in 2022. But those are small logistical things, and those are very CEO related issues, not necessarily company related issues overall. Just the kinds of things that would make my life a little bit more sedate are things that I think about sometimes. But in general, we've made, I would just say, this is a remarkable technology. And, with this technology and an awful lot of hard work and an awful lot of overcoming, again, which I emphasized, engineering in quotes, challenges, places where, hard work and testing and data and trying different things are necessary. With doing all that kind of work, which was clearly not easy, okay, we've just been remarkably, I don't know, lucky is probably the right word. Things have fallen into place. And as I said, it's not really luck. It's the right people. It's the right technology. I like to believe a little bit of it is the right strategic direction. When I'm feeling particularly, proud of myself, I say great leadership. Okay. But I think overall, if you have those kinds of things, you can really do some amazing things overall. And I think we in the company, we really just think we're going to do it. Okay. We're going to make this, and we're going to get it to patients, and we're going to find out if it's truly as remarkable as it can be. No question about it. We just all believe it in our soul.
And you're really proving that out, as you said. So maybe one personal question. We've been asking a lot about the company and about your time with it, but what do you like to do for fun? How do you like to unwind when the pressures of the IPO are too much?
It's a great question. The typical answer is CEOs of growing companies, they don't have fun. And I hate to say it, but that's probably a little more true than I would like it to be. But I certainly solved the problem of having time for myself. I do solitary sports. I jog very, very slowly, I might add, but very persistently. And I also swim. And those are both two activities where you can let your mind wander. Sometimes I come back from a very slow jog or a very long swim, often a slow swim. And I find that some problem that I've been noodling about is just completely solved because I've just had a little time and energy to let my mind wander a little bit. Now, I'm also like, I have a wonderful family, two wonderful kids, two daughter-in-laws, and a wonderful wife. And, with family around, everything is a heck of a lot more fun and just a lot better.
I always love the plug for family. And speaking of, any other closing thoughts, shameless plugs, anything to share with the audience?
No, we don't do shameless plugs. Our feeling is under promise and over deliver. And, I probably come as close to shameless plugs about talking about some of this technology this way. It's very much unlike me in certain ways, but I figured that, or I thought that, this is a chance to share some of the potential of this technology and the work that we've done and really to lay it on the team. And so in a way, I kind of was a little bit more shameless than I would have been because, the team and the people at Prime really deserve that kind of recognition.
It's always easier when you're supporting and putting on not a pedestal necessarily, but touting the work of the team. Absolutely. And
all right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. It's just such a pleasure. And I can't tell you how complimented I am that you were willing to have me and Prime on your, podcast.
well, thank you, Keith, for an absolutely fantastic episode. This has been a phenomenal conversation and a chance to showcase all of what you're building at Prime, which is nothing short of remarkable. So we're very grateful for your coming on and sharing the story and hope to have you back again soon. Thanks again.
My pleasure. I'd be delighted.
Thank you, Keith.